What I will say before I introduce our next group of panelists is that it's really quite fascinating when we think back on Dr. McIntyre's presentation earlier this morning, and he used the phrase critical infrastructure. I think it's probably baffling to many of you in the audience that we have to even think about or argue that our farm and ranch land, from a food and fiber and energy standpoint, is a critical infrastructure of the United States. But it's not surprising that we tend to, in a country of the bounty that we have, often forget the critical infrastructure value and importance of our agricultural land and our farmers and ranchers. But certainly the last panel showed you that cities like San Antonio, New York City, and Dakota County are seeing the value beyond food and fiber of the critical infrastructure or farm and ranch land being a central part of the critical infrastructure of those cities. And dare say that without the kind of initiative that is going on in San Antonio, that they would see significant water shortages or difficulties in the future. So it becomes as much an important part of their critical infrastructure as, you know, traditional roads, bridges, pipelines. So for our panel here on perspectives on programs and policy innovations, we have Jessica Sargent, and we'll go in this order. Jessica Sargent Michaud is the Director of Conservation Economics for the Trust for Public Land. TPL's Conservation Economics program conducts research on the economic benefits and fiscal impacts of land conservation at the local, regional, and state levels. Previously to joining TPL, Jessica was a consultant with Industrial Economics Incorporated, conducting economic analyses of environmental policies and natural resource damage assessment for state and federal agencies. Then we'll hear from Lynn Sherrod. Lynn became the Land Trust Alliance's first Western policy manager in July of 2006. In this capacity, she works with Western land trusts and public policy, advocacy, support for conservation initiatives and legislation. However, in the previous 9 years, she served as executive director of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, the premier agricultural land trust in the country, where she worked extensively with a variety of partners to build bipartisan political support for conservation from the grassroots up. And under her leadership, CCALT partnered with more than 125 ranching families to protect over 225,000 acres of productive working landscapes. We'll hear again from Reed Wilson from PERC in Montana, and then from Scott Campbell. Scott is the coordinator of the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program at the Texas General Land Office, based here in Austin. Previously, Scott served as a state representative in the Texas legislature, where he served on the Natural Resources Committee and is vice chair of the Defense Affairs and State Federal Relations Committee. And Scott's a native of Paint Rock, Texas, where he grew up on a family ranch just north of that small Concho County community. His family's ranch has been in that family since 1877. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, to get this conversation going.
So we've heard a lot today about the public benefits of private land conservation, or just private lands. And what I do at the Trust for Public Land is to estimate the economic value or dollar value of those natural goods and services that are provided by those lands. And let me tell you, I've become very popular in my organization over the last couple of years because as public officials are coming under increasing pressure and shrinking funds, they're asking folks in the field, well, what is the return on investment in these public programs, especially for programs that don't at their surface appear to be vital. It's not education, it's not public safety, but as we know and we've heard today, it's just as vital. It's drinking water quality, wildlife habitat, and a real economic contributor in agricultural products and jobs. Let's see. So how exactly do we go about doing this at TPL? Well, first of all, you got to go out and you have to identify those lands that have been conserved, and I'll go into that in a little more detail, but suffice to say, it's a lot easier then it sounds a lot easier than it is to actually go out and identify those conserved lands, especially when you're talking about private lands with conservation easements. Not everybody wants you to map their family ranch and put that out there, so that can be a little tricky. Once you've identified those lands that have been protected, you need to know what sort of ecosystem types have been protected. Is it wetland? Is it a forest? Is it grasslands? And then where I really come in is determining the economic value of those natural goods and services that those lands provide. I want to take 1 second to talk about the terminology, natural goods and services. The Nature Conservancy has done some extensive surveying on the term ecosystem service valuation. Turns out everybody hates that term. They don't know what it is. They don't care. It sounds bad. So in the spirit of the types of terms that TNC polled, or the Nature Conservancy polled, things that really directly relate, those natural goods and services lands provide, people can understand that. So that's the term we use at TPL. It's exactly the same thing as ecosystem services, but it sounds nicer. Once we've determined the economic value, we can compare that to the state's investment in land conservation and calculate the actual return on investment for that state. And lastly, we try to also gather some economic data. So in the return on investment, we're looking only at those natural goods and services that are provided by those lands. That's not including the direct agricultural production or jobs. It doesn't include the recreational use value or spending. So we like to also include that to give a full picture of the benefits, economic benefits that are being provided. So as I mentioned, it's not easy to identify those lands and to map the lands that have been conserved. And we start by talking to all of the state agencies. And every state is different. Some have done a really good job at mapping the lands that have been conserved, others not so much. And because of that, we at TPL have something called the Conservation Almanac. And what the Conservation Almanac does is it tracks for the entire country all public spending on land conservation and tries to map every parcel acquired since 1998 till present. And we've done this for a little over half the country. And based on that experience, we're lucky if you can get half of the areas that have been conserved mapped in GIS. And then aligned to what was actually spent acquiring those lands or protecting those lands for every parcel. And not just the state spending, but federal spending, nonprofits, local counties, government, municipal officials, and really getting a better understanding of who is contributing to the purchase of conservation easements and fee simple acquisitions. And then we combine that spending data to the geographic information. Like I said, we've been working on, it's not an easy thing to do. We've only done about half the country, and that has taken about 10 years. And we partner with a lot of other organizations to do that. And once we've been able to do that, and for some states, I'm just going to pick on Connecticut here. Turns out Connecticut has never mapped a single acquisition. So we were originally going to do a study of Connecticut, and we can't do it because they've never actually sat down and mapped what they've acquired. So once you do that, then, and I'm going to try to not hit the button or the wrong button, then we can overlay. You can see in black, these are the actual parcels. This is North Carolina. These are the actual parcels that were conserved. You can overlay that with the National Land Cover Database, which is maintained by the USGS Survey Society. Yikes. So the blue, open water, green forest, you get some wetlands in there. So you can start to understand what it is from an ecosystem type or a land cover classification, what has been protected. So that's the first step. Once you know what has been protected, you can start to look at what are the natural goods and services that those land covers provide. And as you probably well know, doing actual original research on a statewide level is incredibly, incredibly expensive and time consuming. So we actually use something called the benefit transfer methodology to try to see what other studies have been done in the state or region that we can transfer to the specific location. And how do people come up with these types of values? Well, there are things like market values, which for grazing, for example. So we know the carrying capacity and the lease rates per AUM, so we can actually understand the rental rate associated with the actual production value. So it's not the full value of the livestock, which includes a lot of other inputs, but the actual value of that forage. You can also look at avoided costs. So Reed mentioned in the Cheney Lake example that there was a reduction in phosphorus associated with an agricultural best management practice that led directly to reductions in water utility treatment costs. So these are not theoretical values. We can actually observe that there are avoided costs associated with land conservation or changes in management practices. And then there are a bit more theoretical values, such as willingness to pay, asking people, well, how much would you be willing to pay to protect these lands that provide these services? Now, that's a San Antonio example. And so when we ask voters, are you willing to pay, I actually don't know what San Antonio was, $15 a year per household to protect water quality, and we're going to acquire, I'm making up numbers here, 10,000 acres. Are you willing to pay? And when they vote yes, that's taking that from the theoretical to the actual. Yes, I'm willing to tax myself to conserve land because I know it's going to either protect or improve water quality. So these are real economic values, and we use that information from relevant, timely, and scientific sources to convert a value or a range of values per land cover type by service, drinking water quality, to get a dollar value per acre. And then we can apply that value to each of the acres that are protected. So you have a benefit value. So you now know that each year that a parcel is protected, it's providing this suite of services and it has this value. And you can apply that over the entire time frame that that piece of property has been protected, and then sum it up to get the total benefits and compare that to the state's investment. And this is all a little abstract. I'll go through a couple of examples where we've actually done this. But we compare the state's actual spending to the benefits, the actual economic value of the benefits that are being provided by that conserved land. So I want to talk a little bit about Colorado. In 2009, there was legislative support for the conservation easement tax credit program was at risk. In fact, they were proposing a permanent reduction by 2/3 of the conservation easement tax credit program. What's a little different about the conservation easement tax credit program in Colorado is that that tax credit is transferable. So if a farmer or a rancher cannot use the tax credit themselves, they can sell it at the open market, and that will provide direct income to the farm or the ranch. And it's been incredibly popular, but like many states, Colorado was looking at a budget shortfall, and they thought, hey, we'll reduce that tax credit, which means more money is going to come into their coffers. Well, not surprisingly, there was a lot of folks who thought that's not such a good idea. That tax credit program has been incredibly popular. It's very helpful, and those lands are providing benefits not only to the ranchers, but to the entire state of Colorado. So we were asked to do a study of, well, what is the return on investment? What sorts of natural goods and services are being provided by those lands? We partnered with the Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts and the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy to do this study. It was so important to the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust that they provided to us GIS of over 100,000 acres that they had never released to any other outside organization. So they understood how important this economic value or return on investment message was going to be to their members. We can't show those maps, mind you, but they did provide us the data. The Nature Conservancy took those maps and overlaid them within the land cover data set to understand what types of lands had been protected, and the Trust for Public Land did the economic valuation. And what we found was that for every $1 invested in conservation easements in Colorado, the state of Colorado got $6 in economic value. That's been very consistent with other reports we've seen across the country, and it's also been a very, very powerful message. It's a simple message, and people inherently get it. I often get the question, do you get pushback? Do people really buy that for every $1 invested in conservation easements, there's a return of $6? And the answer is yes. Because of all the work that's been done on the ground, people, voters especially, understand that land conservation is providing these public benefits, and those public benefits have value to them, and now someone has quantified it in a simple one-sentence message. So we shared these results with the media, and we had peer review from Colorado State University, and we worked with the cooperative extension range experts to come up with some of our values. And we got great positive results. We got a ton of media, some from non-traditional sources, like Business Week, also local sources like the Denver Post and the Durango Herald. This is one of my favorite. I never really thought I'd be in the Western Livestock Journal, talking about how easements pay benefits. Easements are a good investment. Protect Colorado's treasures. Benefits made for you and me. This is all changing the message that conservation easements are a drain on the economy, we can't afford them, they're a luxury, and talking about how conservation easements are an investment, they're a benefit, they pay returns. And that's really what I want to emphasize here today is it's changing the conversation that we can't afford it, this is a luxury, we can't do it, to it's the benefits, it's the public benefits, they have real economic value, it's a high return on investment, because there's a lot of pressure on especially public officials not to invest in these types of programs. I am going to mention, I can't release the results, I'm really disappointed. We've also done similar research in Wyoming. The report's going to be released, it's done. But it's being formatted and printed. It's going to be released on the 19th, so we're super close. But the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust, which began in 2005 and had their first conservation easement projects in 2006, asked us to come in and look at, well, what has the return on investment been? Because conservation easements on agricultural lands are about half of the program of the WWNRT, and the other half is wildlife restoration projects. And there's been some pushback about, well, aren't we only benefiting ranchers? Especially, we've talked about a little bit today, the sage grouse issue and how conservation easements might fit into that. So we took a look, and it's a new program, only began in 2005, only does conservation easements for agricultural lands with wildlife habitat value. They've closed 25 easements. Since 2006 was the first that closed. They've protected 77,000 acres. They've spent around $7 million on those easements, and I'm only talking about the easement portion. We worked in partnership with the University of Wyoming and the Ruckelshaus Institute, who looked at the restoration piece. So that's less than $100 per acre for these easements. So there's been significant matching funds that have come into the state. Private, nonprofit, federal match to protect agricultural areas in Wyoming. And we have found results similar to Colorado. Again, I can't say what they are. I feel really bad. I really wanted to present it. But we have found, even in that short time, with only $7 million, they've been able to protect 77,000 acres, and they have, I think, at least another 100,000 that are currently going through the process that will be closed soon. So it doesn't have to be a large program or an old program to have significant benefits associated with those programs. Also, I mean, they're focused only on agricultural easements. It's not for wildlife habitat. So it's not like you have to have a really broad program. I did want to talk about one other case study, maybe not as applicable as Wyoming and Colorado, but we did also do, the biggest thing, I'm sorry. So what happened? Okay, we released this report. What happened? We got all this great media. We released it to the state legislature in committee hearings, and we reached a favorable compromise. So instead of a permanent 2/3 reduction in the conservation easement tax credit program, they decided to do a reduction of half for the next 3 years. And we are just ending the second year, so there's one more year, and then it will go back to its full level. Now I'll talk about North Carolina. Excuse me. So North Carolina has had 4 popular trust funds, conservation trust funds. They have the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, the Clean Water Trust Fund, the Historic Preservation Trust Fund, and the Agricultural Development and Farmland Preservation Trust Fund. And these trust funds have been historically funded at hundreds of millions of dollars and had been quite popular. But legislative support for funding was at risk. And so the Trust for Public Land was asked by the Land for Tomorrow Coalition in North Carolina to do a return on investment study, similar to Colorado and Wyoming. And we found that every $1 invested in land conservation by the state of North Carolina returned $4. This one was a little bit different. We released it at a very large conservation economics conference in February of this year to mainly the state legislature as an audience. And we had over 200 attendees at that launch, and we had some very influential guest speakers. We had the North Carolina Lieutenant Governor, we had a former governor, we had other mayors and farmers, and actually someone from Fort Bragg, which is a military installation, talking about how important land conservation is to maintaining the Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which itself is the 5th largest city, just the base and the base's population, so it's an incredibly important economic driver to North Carolina. And all of these additional guest speakers talked about how these are real economic values and how there will be real losses associated with reducing funding for land conservation. And again, we got significant media attention about how conservation offers dividends, helps the economy, and has a great return on investment. And it was instrumental in the legislature's decision to retain state funding for land conservation. Thank you.
Just to give you all a frame of reference of who I am, I work for the Land Trust Alliance, as Bob said, and that's the national umbrella organization for land trusts across the country. But who I am personally is my husband and I ranch in western Colorado, and both of our families have ranched for generations. We, once upon a time, not too many years ago, lived in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and my husband family had ranched there for generations as well, but long, ugly story, family ranch sold. We were fortunate enough to walk away with a little bit of money, but not enough to stay in Steamboat, where our families had been forever, and went to a tiny town in the western slope of Colorado, and were able to buy a conserved ranch. So we were able to start a whole new operation, benefiting from the conservation initiatives that we believed in, and are very happy and have loved it there. My husband is really the one who holds the ag operation together. He works extremely hard, and he tries really hard to plan things around my schedule for when I'm home, because I feel really left out if I don't get to participate in branding and working cattle. So But he really is an amazing steward, and he has a very deep love for the land and for his animals. And I'm always telling him that, he should really talk about what he does. And it's the message that we've heard that's resonated throughout this conference is that agriculture really is undervalued, and the public really doesn't understand the contributions that ag land stewardship makes. And my husband and I are total opposites, so we came to the conclusion long ago that he'll do it and I talk about it. So that's the deal that we've made. So I'm here talking about it. One thing that, as I sort of expanded my career into the conservation world, that became really obvious to me is that there really are challenges in the perception of how stewardship equates to public benefit. And a lot of the speakers today have really articulated that much better than I can. But, or the contributions that ag makes to our economy and society, and that's why I was thrilled that Jessica was here addressing that topic as well. What I have discovered that in many areas of society, there is a zero frame of reference about what agriculture is and what it does and the benefits that it provides to society. And this was never more clear to me than one day our communications director in our office, our main office is in Washington, D.C., sent me a video clip of 2 anchors on one of the D.C. TV stations. And I was home alone, and when I watched this, I felt like a fool because I laughed so hard I could hardly wait until my husband got home so he could see it. But the clip showed 2 black cows running around the Beltway in D.C., and they talked about somebody had wrecked their trailer, and these cows had gotten out, and the news anchor that was doing the speaking, kept talking about these 2 pet cows. And I'm thinking, how could he possibly know that they're pet cows, or what would lead him to that conclusion? And finally he said, and his fellow anchor asked him, he said, why do you think they're pet cows? And he said, well, because it says right here their names are Black and Gus. So you get it a little faster than most of the audiences I talk to. And finally his co-anchor sat there and kind of looked at him for a second. He said, do you think that might be the name of the breed? And there was a look of total astonishment on this guy's face. And he went, Black and Gus. And I just thought, and therein lies our dilemma. And I'm sure everybody in here knows that it's Black Angus, and that's a, breed of good cows, which my husband and I are proud to raise. But, it's funny, but it's really sad because that's part of our challenge as agriculture to get past that misconception and total misunderstanding about who we are and what we do. And that's why it really is important to recognize when there is good behavior and to provide rewards for that. That's human nature. We're going to do much better if people say nice things about us and reward us for what we're doing right instead of trying to punish us for what we're doing wrong. And so, as the point has been made also earlier today, incentives at the grassroots level are much, much better than top-down regulation. So one of the things, I'm here to talk about 2 things. One are federal tax incentives, and the other are farm bill programs. And they're really both very complex topics, but I will just skate over some main points, and then I'm happy to answer questions later or afterwards. And I do have some handouts here that will hopefully sort of help you through this too. The federal tax incentive was created years ago, and where the IRS rewarded landowners who donated conservation easements on their property. For years and years, initially, it gave landowners a charitable donor status and gave them a tax benefit up to 30% of their adjusted gross income, and if they couldn't use it in the year of donation, they could spread it out over the next 5 years. So there was a 6 years altogether. Well, that was really great if you were a really wealthy landowner or had some sort of extraordinary income, during that year. But for most of you who know anything about agriculture, agricultural landowners don't need anything to offset their taxes. You actually have to make money to be able to, offset an income. So that really was, while it was wonderful, it was really very meaningless for the agricultural population. So in 1997, there was a Taxpayer Relief Act that improved things a little bit. It allowed for post-mortem donation of easements, which means if you are the executor of a estate and your parents, died and left the family the ranch and didn't do a lot of sophisticated estate planning, which is certainly necessary these days, and you're left with this huge tax bill to pay Uncle Sam, you as an executor can put a conservation easement on that property, which in effect removes the development value of the land and it lowers the value of the land, so it lowers that value that your heirs would inherit and lowers their tax obligation as well. It also included a provision that if you put in your easement some language that is called de minimis language, which none of us really understands what that means, but it addresses a lack of impact on your property for recreational uses. You received an additional discount after your land was valued. You could devalue it another $500,000. And that was great, but it's still really not enough to give a lot of motivation to the more traditional agricultural landowners. So 10 years ago, the concept emerged from Montana and from a group of people up there who worked with a lot of traditional landowners and wanted something meaningful in place that would really motivate and give them benefit that they really deserved. And so this was passed in 2006 as part of the Pension Plan Relief Act. And it provides additional benefit for modest income landowners. And so if you're a regular landowner and you donate an easement on your property, you can now claim up to 50% of your adjusted gross income. And there's a carryover of 15 years. So you have 16 years to use the credit instead of 6 years. And it went from 30 to 50. But the kicker here and the promising thing is that if you're an agricultural landowner and you derive over 50% of your income from agriculture, and that's according to a Schedule F and a series of formulas, so you just can't say, yeah, I do, you have to be able to prove it. You can actually donate over 100 or up to 100% of your adjusted gross income and still carry over for another 15 years. So that really put it in the ballpark where some of these agricultural landowners really could begin to think about donating a conservation easement. Because the one thing that we all really need to think about, and I loved Reed's comment of, if it pays, it stays. You have to make this meaningful because these landowners can't afford to give away the only thing of value that they have, and often, which is their land. And it represents a host of benefits to them, their kids going to college, their retirement fund, their ability to pass it on to the next generation, and they deserve to have some sort of benefit because they do offer a lot of public benefits, which we've talked about, many times today. It really has leveled the playing field, but where this has really provided a lot of important benefit additionally is those landowners who do bargain sales. So in the counties where there's money or states where there's money to purchase easements, hardly ever are those easements purchased 100% of the value. And so if the landowner donates a portion of that easement, then they can use this tax benefit to offset this untraditional income and be able to get a tax benefit for that. And it really makes it a much more attractive package for them. So Congress has passed this 3 times in 2-year increments, and it sunsets again at the end of this month. And it really, what our goal is to try and make it permanent, make it a permanent part of the tax law. They've tested it out. There has been monumental success in this. And one thing that we really know, and anybody who works with agricultural landowners knows, that they really need time to be able to think about this. If putting a perpetual contract on their property is really a very frightening thing sometimes, and it deserves a lot of careful attention. And you can't be forced to do things just because there's an artificial deadline coming up at the end of the year. So we also think that's a very strong argument for making this tax incentive permanent, is to give not just the landowners, but the land trust who are trying to be strategic in their time and the projects they work on, the ability to plan over a number of years rather than, hurry up and wait. And the last time it was passed was at the beginning of this year, and it was passed for 2 years. However, one of those years was retroactive to the previous year. So, if you happen to do an easement in 2010, why, that was really great, you got a benefit, but there was nobody that could plan on it. And so now again, it was for this year, and it sunsets at the end of the year. So there are currently twin bills in the House and Senate. It's one of the very few bipartisan issues that are on the Hill these days, that both parties like, that, both sides of the fence, that the conservatives and the liberals think is a great investment. It's impressive with its diverse list of people and organizations who are supporting this. And outside, there's a handout that's called the Federal Tax Incentive for Conservation Easements. And there's bulleted information about it, but also gives you a list of all the organizations that are supporting this. And I mean, it's from the American Bird Conservancy to National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And so it's a list of partners that you normally wouldn't see together on any other typical piece of legislation. So, in case you're going to ask, and I'd love to tell you, Texas has, as you probably know, 32 congressional districts. The good news is that 17 of your representatives have co-sponsored this legislation. The challenge is 15 have not. And we would really love to see, those folks step up and sign. Right now, there are 268 co-sponsors in the House. We'd really like to see 300. We need 24 more Republicans to get a majority in the House, so there'll be a majority of both parties. Right now, this piece of legislation has more support and co-sponsors than any other piece of tax legislation in Congress. So that really tells you something. So what does this mean for Texas? And how has it been successful across the country? What has the incentive really inspired? Well, I'm glad you asked. We just finished a census. Every 5 years, the Land Trust Alliance does a census of its members to see what really, the trends in land conservation. And it asks a number of questions, but the obvious one is, how many acres have you conserved, and, how many easements do you have? And we were, wondering, because of the, the sort of up and down nature of the incentive and, the economic climate, we weren't quite sure, what we were going to see with this. But the results have been pretty impressive. And there's also a sheet out there, a fact sheet on Texas about the 2010 census that you can pick up as well. But in a nutshell, what we found out that there are 36 state and local land trusts in Texas. Now, I'm not talking about the national groups at all, sorry. And, but this is just to really see what on-the-ground conservation is happening. And we do have, those statistics as well. But Texas now has protected over 375,261 acres, which is a 55% increase since 2001, or 2005. But it's even more significant is that the Texas, the 7 ag land trusts that Blair referred to this morning, of the Partnership of Rangeland Trusts, has protected since then 700,000 acres since the incentive was enacted, and a quarter of all the easement acreage by the 1,700 state and local land trusts nationwide. The national trends are that total acres are conserved by the state, local, and national grew to 47 million, an increase of 10 million acres since 2005. So the incentive really has provided significant benefit. Very quickly, 2 programs that are really of great interest probably to this group, that provide funding, that the funding is provided for from Farm Bill, which is overseen by National Resource Conservation Service, are the Farm and Ranchland Protection Program and the Grassland Reserve Program. And those programs have been very much at risk through the new Farm Bill negotiations, and so we have been monitoring that closely. The last intelligence we have is the easement programs for working lands are probably going to be consolidated in the new Farm Bill. And there has been an element for the Grassland Reserve Program that allows for short-term contracts. That's probably going to go away and be incorporated into a different easement program. And some of the success, though, from 2000, since up to 2010, FRPP has enrolled over 800,000 acres with more than 400 entities in 44 states, and Grassland Reserve Program has enrolled 225,000 perpetual acres in 38 states. And there's also a couple fact sheets outside and a couple of, and there's some good information in the booklet that that TALT has put out for today's conference. So we don't know what the future is with the failure of the Deficit Reduction Act. We think we were in a pretty good position with the Farm Bill. They had proposed a $23 billion cut, 6.5 of that to the conservation programs, and we don't know exactly, the construction of that, what programs were going to be cut. There's a lot of rumors about what's happening next, and we'll let you know. It's not going to be pretty. We're pretty sure of that, but so we're trying to build a strong consensus and foundation for the conservation programs that we can.
What I'm going to talk about, what Blair asked me to speak about was sort of the paradigm of my organization, PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center. We espouse a way of thinking, a kind of paradigm called free market environmentalism. I sort of alluded to that in this morning's session with some specific examples of how it might work, but I actually want to take a step back and talk more about principles, and then I'm going to drill down pretty carefully down to the issue of this conference, which is maintaining rural landscapes in Texas. This might feel like an experience I had just recently. I was flying on a plane to Atlanta, and the pilot came with the intercom and he said, "Are there any doctors or nurses on board?" Oh no, someone was sick and somebody was having chest pains, and I thought it was a heart attack. So we're coming in, and instead of doing that smooth circle, a couple loops around the airport, smooth landing, getting the queue of all the planes in the air, we went from 30,000 feet to the tarmac in about 5 minutes, just straight down. And that's what this presentation is going to feel like. So buckle your seatbelt. We're going from 30,000 to the tarmac very quickly. 3 tenets. I'm going to use an acronym, which I hate. I'm sorry, but I need more room. 3 tenets of free market environmentalism, okay? The first is that wealth matters, okay? The reason I'm saying I'm going to go through this is that any policy, any regulation in Texas that makes people, particularly private landowners, poor is going to negatively affect the quality of the environment in Texas, okay? Wealthier is healthier. Second tenet, prices matter, okay? This is econ speak here, but demand curves slope downward. Things cost a lot, we consume not very much. When things get cheaper, we consume more, okay? That's as true of a law as gravity, at least in economics. And finally, enviropreneurs matter. And if that word looks misspelled, technically it's not because we have the trademark on it, but enviropreneur is a combination of entrepreneur and environmentalist, okay? Folks who care about conservation, who are business people, who are creative and can come up with solutions to problems that we typically think are just too hard. The current status quo doesn't work for. Enviropreneurship matters, okay? Another more econ speak, if you'll pardon me, is reducing externalities. Everybody's heard that term, externalities, maybe? A lot of times you think about a contract, a buyer and a seller, and sometimes a third party external to the contract is harmed, okay? Or benefited, okay? Enviropreneurs don't tolerate externalities. They capture those benefits, they capture those harms, and they also reduce transaction costs. Okay, now we're getting our initial descent. Wealthier is healthier. This is a graph, and I apologize for those who don't think graphically, but it demonstrates fairly convincingly, at least to me, that countries who are wealthier, this is GDP per capita, in other words, how much each person in the country makes in a year, or produces in a year, I should say, graphs against an environmental index. This on the y-axis is an index of air quality measures, of water quality measures, water supply, habitat, all those different kind of things that you think environmentalists, when you think of environmentalism. What do you see? A fairly positive trend. As countries get wealthier, they also tend to demand more and better environmental services and qualities, okay? Why am I showing you this? Well, you can look, and I don't know if you can read the text, but you see the U.S. is towards the end here. We're a fairly wealthy country. Canada, this is, by the way, this is purchasing power parity, so it's not actually, these numbers, if they look wrong to you, they're not, but it's a slightly different measure. You see there's a positive trend here. Countries like Ethiopia, very poor. People don't have time, resources to worry about environmental issues, okay? They've got more pressing needs, okay? What you see is this positive trend. The reason I bring this up, the reason it's a tenet of free market environmentalism is that policies, state policies, local policies, especially federal policies that make people poor tend to harm the environment, okay? So think about that in your legislative sessions and your administrative sessions. Next, prices matter. Prices matter a whole bunch, particularly for water. Let me show you a graph. Del Gardner, who was a colleague of PERC quite a few years ago, this is a Central Utah project, gathered this data. This is slightly dated data, so don't quote. I'll share this with you, but don't quote it. This is from a federal Bureau of Reclamation project, water supply project. I don't know if you can read the graphs here. This is the, oh, I hit the wrong button. This is the cost of supplying water to members in the Bureau project. Okay, roughly $300 per. It's not acre feet. I think it actually is. Maybe it is acre. No, dollars per cubic meter. That's cost figure. Okay, that's what it costs to actually operate, deliver, deliver the water. This is the value that the farmers in the project placed on it. Okay, less than $50 per cubic meter. Okay, this is the rate charged to the farmers. Okay, what incentives does this create? The cost is here, the benefit's here, and here's the sort of external cost, if you will, to use a heck of a lot of water, right? To use it and use it and use it because it doesn't cost much. And it certainly costs less than the benefits that accrue, okay? Prices matter. We talk about resources, we talk about water, and especially in Texas where water is scarce, water quality is scarce. Important policy is to make sure that we're charging cities, municipalities, individual tap users the actual cost of treating and delivering the water to them, okay? When people face the actual cost of their behaviors, they tend to conserve, okay? That's an important principle. The last one that I'm going to focus on today is that enviropreneurship matters, okay? Reducing transaction costs and reducing externalities. I'm going to I think I explained earlier what enviropreneurs are. PERC, my organization, has what we call the Enviropreneur Institute. It's a 2-week training program in the summer where we have folks from all over the country, all over the world come and learn about free market environmentalism. They come with a specific problem, okay? And we work with them, we help them develop business plans, we introduce them to economic fundamentals. We create a network. Probably the most important thing we do is that we link up a whole bunch of creative problem solvers throughout the country and the world in this Enviropreneur Institute. If you know of anybody, or if you yourself, that interests you, please contact me. It's a great program, just a quick plug. The term enviropreneurs, what we're talking about is folks who are not tolerant of externalities, okay? If a private landowner and a wheat buyer have a deal for wheat or for cows, okay, that's the transaction. But today we've been talking about all of the good environmental stewardship that occurs on private lands, okay? That is a positive externality that we as society are not being charged for, okay? So if San Antonio is enjoying clean water because Farmer Joe upstream on the plateau is conducting very good water management practices, okay, San Antonio ought to be paying that person, that farmer, for their good behavior, okay? That's a positive externality, and enviropreneurs try to capture it. I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. One that's, a few that are quite relevant, one that you might just find interesting. This is Brett Howell. He just came through this year's program. He works off of Florida. His mission is to restore Florida's coral reefs. It turns out that bad water quality, you go to enough regions around the country and you hear a lot of the same problems. Water quality, agricultural runoff is contributing to the decline in coral reef off Florida's coast. Brett and some colleagues have figured out how to plant coral reef, to grow it in a nursery and actually plant and bolster these reefs, okay? It's not free. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. But there's a lot of folks who enjoy doing it, namely scuba divers, okay? Brett's a scuba diver, and that's why he's motivated to do this. But one of the things that Brett is doing is working on selling a medallion that goes on the side of a boat. Basically, dive shop operators, the folks who give you the scuba tours, can buy this medallion. They're not cheap, but it basically is reputation that says, I have invested in this environmental resource that drives my business, okay? When divers come down to Florida, they want to see, at least we're hoping because we're working on this, we have a conference in February, they want to see, they will be willing to pay a premium perhaps to hire a tour guide that is paid for coral reef restoration, okay? That's what we consider an enviropreneurial idea, okay? It's really hard to think about how do you sell restored coral reef? It's not a market good, but you can sell reputation. You can sell little stickers, okay? So let's think about ideas like that. Another one, this pen, which I had in my pocket open, is from another enviropreneur. It is a tree ring pen made by Dave Wager in Missoula, Montana. And like many forests, I assume, Montana's got some native species and some invasive species. And a lot of the invasive species have choked out the native species. Well, a lot of folks get upset about that. The tree experts and hikers want to see a restored native forest. What Dave has started doing is culling the invasive species from some forest in Montana and making them into a tree ring pin that has history from when this tree was planted up until now, up until he came through PEI in 2010. This is an example of a market product that captures some of these public goods. We think about how, it's so hard to capture the public goods that are produced from private lands. In some respects, we don't have to. We can piggyback them on creative, clever, marketable goods like this. Okay, so I'm speaking mostly to the private landowners in the room, the ranchers, because I realized after lunch that there's quite a few ranchers and landowners in the room, and I shouldn't just pick on the legislators. You guys think about the public goods that you are producing. Is there a clever way that you can capture some of that value? Okay, would that value make a difference in terms of staying on your land? Another example of that, more relevant to Texas, although he's actually in Arizona, is Paul Schwinneson. He's a former Air Force fellow who's born and raised on a ranch called the Double Check in northern Arizona. He and his wife are facing a lot of the pressures that landowners in Texas are, okay? State tax issues, declining revenues, okay? They want to stay on the ranch. They want their kids to stay on the ranch, okay? What are they doing now? They're actually trying to process grass-fed beef, okay? They've distinguished their product from the traditional operation, cow-calf operation. They're actually growing jerky. And they're growing all these different kind of products and manufacturing themselves and selling it at a premium. I wouldn't have tasted it but for the fact that he gave it to me. Okay, those kind of innovative solutions are ones that I think private landowners can consider. It's important to focus on legislators, to focus on policy, but also as landowners we've got to be creative and innovative. And lastly, and I don't have a picture of her quite regrettably, Ariel Still. Somebody mentioned her earlier the transferable tax credits. This is where we're going to drill down into a very specific policy that might be relevant to Texas. I don't think tax credits in Texas are transferable. I think it's only Colorado, North Carolina, South Carolina, 14 states. Well, I won't try to name them all then. Quick overview, just to recap, make sure we're talking about the same thing. The tax incentive is not alone enough to do a conservation easement. That was said very clearly in the video, thankfully. But to the extent that there are tax incentives for private landowners who don't have a lot of income to write off, being able to transfer that to a hedge fund manager in Austin or Dallas or an oil man in Houston might actually mean that the incentive is more significant for private landowners considering an easement. That's something that Texas might consider. Okay? In those states where there are transferable tax credits, at the margin you do see more donations. Okay? Holding all else equal, if you can imagine doing that. That's a specific policy recommendation that might work for Texas. That's all I have prepared for this quick remarks. I'm going to keep this brief and hopefully during the Q&A at the end of this panel, I would like to quiz you guys and see if there are any ideas that you guys have that are applicable in Texas. I keep hearing how unique Texas is, and I'm convinced. But I think we've got to start thinking critically about, are there ways that we can capture some of the public goods that flow from private Texas lands? Are there some policies at the margin that we can tweak so that we make private lands in Texas more resilient? Thanks again for having me, and I'll pass the baton.
I'll talk to you a little about the program that I'm here to talk to you about. And I heard something funny on the way into town this morning. I didn't plan on working for the state. It wasn't in my retirement plan. It just kind of happened. But so I live south of town. I have a pretty good commute into Austin every morning. And this morning I was listening to KASC, which is the country music station. And this ad came on and it said, come by this weekend and buy your 5-acre ranch. And you know, I had spent last year fighting cancer, so I made a lot of trips from my house to Houston, and on that road from my house to down toward Bastrop, there are a lot of little 5-acre ranches, and they have little fallen down trailer houses on them, and they're covered up with cars that don't work anymore. So you know, it's sad to say that this beautiful state of ours is turning into that, but it was funny for me this morning to hear that about a 5-acre ranch, because I've got a 1/8 of an acre ranch behind my house that I'm protecting right now with a dog. But it's you know, the program that I'm here to talk about is, and I do have a PowerPoint. It's out there on the table. There's several of these, and if nothing else gets across today, I hope that somebody will take one of these and hand it to Speaker Strauss, because I'm not going to Speaker Strauss's. I'd probably, since I'm a state employee, I'd have to sign some kind of form if I went to see lobby Speaker Strauss. So if somebody will make sure he gets one of our brochures, I would appreciate it, because we need a messenger in the state legislature, and he would be a good one. But the program that I'm responsible for is called I wish they'd come up with a different name, but it's called the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program. So I can't say something like TREC, you know, or whatever these other acronyms are. It has to be, we call it over at the land office the Farm and Ranch Program. So that's what's become, so that's what I'll call it from now on. But I would have to say Blair Fitzsimmons is largely responsible for this program being in existence, and it was passed in the legislature in 2005. In the House, it was passed by Charlie Guerin, and in the Senate by Senator Jackson, both of whom have helped us since that time make little adjustments as we learn what we're doing. The program basically was just passed as a shell of a program. We were in it. I served over there then. We were in a deficit as we are now, not as bad as the deficit is now, but any new program that had funding attached to it at the end of that session, the money was stripped. So what we ended up with was a program with no money. So I happened to run into James LeGrand one day, who's the chief administrative officer over at the land office, who I knew, and in this, they'd had two guys that tried to figure out what to do with this program over there, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it. And James said, "Scott, you want to come talk to us about this?" And I said, "Well, okay, I'll come talk to you about it." And you know, when I first heard the word conservation easement, I'm like the old-time ranchers that Stan Metter and some of the rest of us know that, you know, anything that has to do with conservation or environmentalist, you know, we run backwards. That's why I was brought up as a kid. You just don't say those words, and you don't say that I have friends that are environmentalists. So the first obstacle I had after I researched the program and remembered, I mean, the program passed through the legislature so quickly because the money had been detached by that time, and it passed through local consent, I think. So there was no debate even about the program when it passed through the legislature. The first obstacle I had when I agreed that, you know, this is another cause, and I understand this is going to be an uphill battle to try to run a program with no funding. And my first obstacle is going to be to convince my dad, who at the time was about 80, that I'm going to be running a conservation program for the state of Texas. So that night I remember calling my dad and trying to tell him what I was going to do, because whatever I do, I have to have his blessing. And he said, "You're going to be one of those government guys that comes takes our land away from us?" And so I finally, it's taken me, we've been over there doing this now for 4 years, and I finally convinced him. He still doesn't like to talk about it, but I finally convinced him that, you know, we've got a couple of projects going now, thankfully, and I finally convinced him that what we're trying to do is to help ranchers keep their land and the families, and keep landowners in business. And we were over the Thanksgiving. I'm getting totally away from what I had planned to say here, but it doesn't matter. What we were talking about over the Thanksgiving holidays, George Cofer's been down to our ranch, and we have the Indian pictographs on our ranch at Paint Rock, and this ranch is been in our family since 1877, and during the time that I was away from the office, away from work, dealing with this cancer stuff, I started working on a book about the pictographs that my dad had been wanting us to do, and I started reading some of the old documents that had been passed down from my family, and feeling the attachment that they had to this place. And this is typical of a lot of old ranch families, like Stan Metters back there. I've been to his ranch. I know exactly how attached his family is, and Ryland over there, I've been out to his place, and I know how he is. And, you know, Dad still, to this day, would not allow us to have a conservation easement on our ranch as long as he's alive. But he, and I don't know how long I've been talking, but somebody wave a flag or something. But he did have this conversation with me the other day during Thanksgiving about how, you know, they put the pictographs. The ranch is about 3,000 acres. Is it my time? Is the time up? He said that we're worried about what to do with this ranch because it's got the pictographs on it. So their accountant has advised them. The accountant, is that a time thing, or is that just okay? The accountant has advised them to put this land around the pictographs in a trust for the kids. And so Dad said when he was talking to the kids about it, he hadn't talked to me about it. We talked to my two kids and my brother's two kids, which is fine. It didn't matter to me. It's none of my business. But he said the first question the kids asked him, well, who's going to pay the inheritance tax? And so one of my kids talked to me about it, and I said, well, I guess, you know, I haven't read the will, and I don't know what's in it, but I guess what we're going to have to do is sell part of the other ranch, part of the rest of the ranch to pay the inheritance tax. So that's, you know, I understand exactly what it is here we're trying to do. Our dilemma at the General Land Office, as I said in the very beginning, is finances. And we have been able to come up with about $6 million in federal funds that is coastal in nature. It's called Coastal Impact Assistance Program money. We've done 2 projects. We just did one in northwestern Harris County, which is fairly sizable. We've done a 700-acre project down in Brazoria County, which is a rice farm. And these are places that have been in families for a lot of years. And, you know, someday we're going to find and Senator Hager hadn't gotten here yet, has he? I was going to remind him, now's my time up? Okay. I just want to say this one more thing, because somebody can tell him. I'd rather somebody else tell him than me anyway. But Senator Hager and I went into the legislature at the same time. He's obviously been a lot more successful because he's a state senator and I'm now working for the state. But I was going to remind him of the time that I flew from San Angelo to Houston to walk door to door for his campaign because he had a primary opponent and I didn't. And so I was going to remind him that he owes me a favor. So if we can remind him, Blair, would you remind him of that? Probably not, but somehow get the message to him. But anyway, our message today is that we need we have a great program, and it's been well thought out. We've written a good plan for the program. We just need funding. So work on your House members and senators, and we need to find a messenger in the legislature. And thanks very much.
I think to underscore Scott's last point about the need for the Texas Farm and Ranchland Conservation Program to have a consistent source of funding is that Texas, given its size and the size of its land base as well as its agriculture, actually receives very little in federal funding through the Federal Farm and Ranchland Conservation Program, Federal Farmland Protection Program, Farm and Ranchland Protection Program, and states as small as Maryland is getting far more than Texas is because of the robust program that they have there and the fact that they have a consistent source of funding. This is a program that does not allocate money on a state-by-state basis. It allocates the money where the demand is. And if the demand is here but you don't have the matching funds, it's going to go somewhere else. And if the money isn't used up at the end of the year, it's redistributed to the states that have the demand. So even though Maryland may initially get, say, $3 or $4 million in the first round, it's going to get some of that other money that's been left on the table, and dare say that some of that money's been left on the table by Texas over the last 10 to 15 years. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has one, yes, back here, Blair's got the microphone.
Lynn, this question's for you. The bill that's currently in Washington, you mentioned the interest in trying to get that as a permanent permanent status. What is the one that's actually circulating around right now? Is that just a renewal? That would be a temporary renewal again?
It would just, it would permanently extend the current bill. Oh, you hear me? It would permanently, the bill now is just to permanently extend the current bill.
So
Yeah.
To
make it
permanently
permanent.
extend it, okay, all right. And you might remind us as well, a quick and easy way, I think you or some of the other organizations have posted which of those co-authors are and who we might be looking for to target as far as our representatives go.
I mean, afterwards, I'm happy to tell you, but the quick and easy way, you can go online at lta.org and on public policy, and there's a map there that you can click on, and it tells you who's co-sponsoring and who's not. Thank you for asking.
Any other questions? I'm going to direct one to Jessica. In the studies that you talked about in both Colorado and North Carolina, you talked about being able to quantify the investment per acre or per dollar spent by the states. Did you also factor into that avoided costs, like community service costs and other expenses that would have been incurred if the land had not been protected?
That's a great question. So in the return on investment for every $1 invested, the $4 to $10 return, no. But each of those reports does also have a section on what are the avoided costs of government services for different land use types, and what are the recreational values, how many visitors are coming, how much they're spending in local economies. Those are included in the report, but not that figure. So those are above and beyond the natural goods and services provided.
So it's fair to say that those numbers, the $4 to $10, are fairly conservative numbers.
Fairly conservative. Our feeling has always been that we want to be as conservative as possible, more likely to underestimate than overestimate, so that we are credible with the most audiences. Because if we overestimate, maybe we'll get a traction with a report, but then very soon people will stop listening. So we want to make sure that we're highly credible and using the lower bound estimates.